4,500 years ago, a group of men moved 2.3 million blocks of stone, some weighing as much as 9 tons, without a single wheel, without iron tools, without any machine more advanced than a wooden sledge and a length of rope. They finished a monument so precise that its 4 sides deviate from true north by only a few hundredths of a degree, a structure so massive that it remained the tallest building on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. And they were not improvising, they were following a plan. Somewhere in Egypt, before a single stone was quarried, a team of men had already decided the height, the angle, the internal chambers, the supply routes, the workforce numbers, and the timeline. This is the story of that plan, and of the kings who kept revising it, generation after generation, until they built the most ambitious construction project in human history. To understand how the Great Pyramid became possible, you have to go back 1 generation earlier to a king named Sneferu. Sneferu was Khufu's father, and he is, in many ways, the real architect of the Pyramid Age. Before Sneferu, Egyptian kings built step pyramids, staircases to the sky modeled on the tomb of Djoser. Sneferu wanted something different. He wanted a smooth-sided, true geometric pyramid, and he was willing to fail publicly to get there. His first attempt at Medum collapsed or was abandoned after its outer casing gave way, most likely because the outer layers were built at too steep an angle and set on a foundation of sand and loose debris rather than solid rock, giving the whole outer shell nothing firm to grip onto as its own weight increased. Walking around Medum today, you can still see the result, a strange, tower-like core standing alone in the desert, surrounded by a low mound of rubble, the collapsed remains of the outer casing that once made it a true pyramid. His second attempt, the so-called bent pyramid at Dashur, had to change its angle midway through construction because the original slope, close to 54 degrees, was too steep and threatened to destabilize the whole structure, producing visible cracking in the internal chambers as building continued. Rather than tear the structure down and start again, Sneferu's engineers made a decision that still stands as one of the earliest recorded examples of mid-project structural correction in world history. They simply changed the angle partway up, reducing the incline to a safer roughly 43 degrees for the upper portion, giving the pyramid its distinctive bent profile and its modern name. Only with his third attempt, the Red Pyramid built from the start at that safer, shallower angle, did Sneferu succeed in building a stable, true pyramid. In other words, before Khufu ever laid a single foundation stone, Egyptian engineers had already run a series of full-scale, real-world structural experiments, and they had learned at enormous cost exactly what worked and what did not. Information that almost certainly passed directly from the builders of the Red Pyramid to the builders of the Great Pyramid a few years later, likely through some of the very same senior craftsmen and officials. This matters because it destroys a common myth about the Great Pyramid, the idea that it appeared suddenly, as if by inspiration or outside help. It did not. It was the 4th major pyramid project in a single royal family, built on the accumulated data of 3 previous attempts, 2 of which had gone wrong. Khufu inherited not just a treasury and a workforce, but a body of engineering knowledge paid for in his father's failures, along with an experienced administrative structure already accustomed to organizing enormous quarrying and transport operations. Khufu became king in around 2589 BC, and almost immediately the plan for his own monument began to take shape on the Giza Plateau, a stretch of high desert bedrock across the river from the sprawling capital of Memphis. The choice of location was itself a piece of engineering strategy. Giza sat on a natural limestone plateau, which meant the pyramid could be built on solid rock rather than sand, giving it a foundation that would not shift or settle unevenly over time, the very problem that had doomed the outer casing at Medum. It was close enough to the Nile that a harbor and canal system could be dug to bring boats loaded with stone almost directly to the construction site, yet elevated enough to be visible for miles in every direction, a deliberate statement of royal power. The man credited with turning Khufu's ambitions into an actual construction plan was Hemiunu, a vizier, and, according to inscriptions found in his tomb near the pyramid, overseer of all the king's works. Hemiunu held titles that placed him in charge of the quarries, the workforce, and the royal building projects, making him the closest thing the ancient world had to a chief structural engineer. Statues of Hemiunu show a large, confident man seated with his arms crossed, an image of someone accustomed to command. And modern anatomical study of his statue has even suggested he may have suffered from a lipid disorder, a small human detail preserved in stone for 45 centuries. It was Hemiunu's job to solve problems that had never been solved before. How do you move stones weighing several tons across open desert? How do you lift them more than 140 meters into the air? And how do you keep tens of thousands of workers fed, housed, and organized for years at a time? The scale of the plan becomes clear when you look at the numbers. The Great Pyramid originally stood about 146 meters tall, with a base measuring roughly 230 meters on each side, built from an estimated 2.3 million blocks of limestone and granite. Its four sides are aligned to the cardinal points with a margin of error smaller than what most modern buildings achieve with satellite positioning. Achieving that kind of precision without magnetic compasses required real astronomical knowledge. Egyptian surveyors most likely used the simultaneous rising and setting of certain stars to fix true north, a technique that required careful, repeated observation of the night sky and a level horizon, both of which the flat desert around Giza provided. Leveling the site itself across such a large area without modern surveying instruments likely relied on shallow trenches filled with water, a simple but highly effective way of establishing a perfectly flat reference plane across hundreds of meters of open bedrock. For decades, the biggest mystery of the Great Pyramid was not its design, but its supply chain. How did a Bronze Age society without wheeled transport for heavy loads move that much stone across that much distance in a matter of years? The answer came into focus only recently, thanks to a discovery on the shore of the Red Sea. In 2013, a French archaeological team led by Pierre Tallet was excavating a site called Wadi El Jarf, an ancient harbor roughly 120 kilometers south of modern Suez. Inside, man-made caves used to store boats, the team found fragments of papyrus, and when they were unrolled and translated, they turned out to be the oldest inscribed documents ever discovered in Egypt, older even than the pyramids of Giza themselves in terms of surviving written material. The papyri were the work log of a middle-ranking official named Mer, who commanded a team of about 40 men as part of a larger unit called the escort boat crew. The papyri were the work log of a middle-ranking official named Mer, who commanded a team of about 40 men as part of a larger unit called the escort boat crew. Tallet and his colleague Gregory Marward described the find as a timetable, organized in 2 columns per day, recording operations tied directly to construction work at the Great Pyramid and to activity at the limestone quarries across the Nile. Merer's crew spent their days ferrying blocks of high-quality white limestone from the quarries at Tura, on the eastern bank of the Nile, to the construction site at Giza. Their round trips took place 2 or 3 times within each 10-day Egyptian week, and this high river traffic was only possible during the annual Nile flood, when high water levels made it easier to navigate boats loaded down with stone. This limestone from Tura was not the same material used for the bulk of the pyramid's core, which came from quarries right on the Giza plateau itself. Tura stone was reserved for the fine, brilliant white outer casing, the layer that would have made the finished pyramid gleam in the sun, a surface almost entirely stripped away by later builders looking for ready-cut stone and now visible only at the very top of Khafre's pyramid, where a small cap of original casing still survives. The diary even names the internal waterways of the construction site itself, describing an artificial basin called the Pool of Khufu, apparently a staging harbor built specifically to receive incoming shipments of stone before they were hauled the final stretch to the pyramid. This detail confirms something archaeologists had long suspected. The Giza Plateau was not simply a building site, it was a functioning port and logistics hub, engineered with the same intent as the pyramid itself. Merer's logbook is dated to what appears to be the 27th year of Khufu's reign, and it is thought to represent one of the very last periods of active construction before the king's death, meaning we have, essentially, a first-hand production record from the final phase of the most famous building project in history. The math behind that production record is staggering. Based on typical boat capacities of the period, researchers estimate Merer's single team could move around 200 blocks a month, and as many as 1,000 blocks during the weeks when the Nile floodwaters were highest. And Merer's team was only one of several such crews operating at the same time. This tells us that the Great Pyramid was not built by an anonymous, undifferentiated mass of slaves, a myth popularized by later Greek writers and Hollywood films. It was built by an organized, salaried, rotating labor force, divided into work gangs with names like the Friends of Khufu Gang, each gang further split into smaller crews like Merer's, each with its own supervisors, quotas, and schedules. Excavations of a nearby settlement known as the Pyramid Workers' Town have turned up bakeries capable of producing thousands of loaves of bread a day, breweries, and animals. Bone remains showing that laborers were fed meat regularly, including cattle, sheep, and goat. Evidence of a well-supplied, well-managed workforce rather than a starved and abused one. Cemeteries found near the workers' town further support this picture, containing the burials of laborers who received modest but genuine funerary care, some showing signs of healed fractures that had been set and treated, suggesting the workforce had access to basic medical attention rather than being simply worked to death and discarded. The internal design of the Great Pyramid also reveals a construction plan that was adjusted as it went along, not fixed from the very first day. Inside the monument are at least 3 distinct chambers cut at different heights. An unfinished chamber cut into the bedrock beneath the pyramid, a so-called queen's Chamber partway up, in the king's chamber near the pyramid's core, built entirely from massive granite blocks, transported over 800 kilometers from quarries at Aswan, hauled downriver on boats during the flood season. In a logistics operation every bit as above the king's chamber, engineers built a series of stress-relieving compartments, stacked granite slabs designed to redirect the crushing weight of the stone above away from the ceiling of the burial chamber, preventing it from collapsing under millions of tons of pressure. This is not the work of a society blindly stacking rocks. It is the work of engineers who understood load distribution well enough to solve one of the most difficult structural problems in the entire building, using nothing but geometry and an intimate, hard-won understanding of how stone behaves under pressure. Even the boats used to bring material to Giza became part of the pyramid complex itself. Buried in pits alongside the pyramid, archaeologists found 2 full-sized cedarwood ships, disassembled into more than 1,000 pieces each, and packed away with such care that one of them has since been fully reconstructed and put on display. For decades, these were assumed to be purely symbolic solar barks, vessels meant to carry the king's spirit across the sky in the company of the sun god. More recent examination of the second, still unassembled boat suggests a more practical possibility, that it may have functioned as a funerary vessel used to carry Khufu's body during his burial, rather than existing purely as religious symbolism, showing how the practical and the spiritual were often the same object in Egyptian construction planning. When Khufu died, the plan did not simply repeat itself. His son and successor, Djedefre, broke from Giza entirely and built his own, much smaller pyramid at Abu Rawash, roughly 8 kilometers to the north, on a plateau high enough to overlook his father's monument. Djedefre's reign appears to have lasted only a handful of years, which likely explains why his pyramid was left incomplete, and why later generations stripped it almost entirely for building material. But Djedefre's reign marks a turning point in ancient Egyptian religious and political thinking that shaped everything that followed. He was the first king to formally attach the epithet Son of Ra to his royal titles, tying kingship directly and explicitly to the sun god, in a way earlier pharaohs had not. From this point forward, a growing number of kings incorporated Ra's would continue for generations, and that reflects a genuine strengthening of solar religion at the very moment the Pyramid Age reached its peak. The pyramids themselves, standing as artificial mountains reaching toward the sun, were not separate from this theology. They were built expressions of it. The next king, Khafra, brought construction back to Giza and built a pyramid clearly designed to rival and visually surpass his father's. Khafra's pyramid is, in strict terms, slightly smaller than the Great Pyramid, standing at roughly 143 meters tall against Khufu's 146, with a base of about 215 meters compared to Khufu's 230. But Khafra's engineers used 2 clever tricks to make it appear larger. First, they built it on a section of the plateau bedrock ruffle, 10 meters higher than the base of Khufu's pyramid. Second, they gave it a slightly steeper angle of incline. The result is a monument that, viewed from a distance across the plateau, looks taller and more imposing than the mathematically larger pyramid beside it, an early and effective piece of architectural illusion. Khafra's complex also included a long stone causeway connecting his valley temple by the Nile floodplain to the pyramid itself, a covered processional route that doubled as a practical supply corridor during construction, and later served as the ceremonial path for the king's funeral procession, tying engineering necessity and religious ritual into a single piece of architecture. Khafra's pyramid complex also includes one of the best preserved examples of Old Kingdom construction anywhere in Egypt, the Valley Temple that once served as the entrance to his funerary complex. Its floors are lined with pale alabaster, and its massive support piers are cut from solid red granite, creating a striking 2-tone interior that has survived almost entirely intact for 4,500 years. Beneath this temple's floor, excavators discovered a statue of Khafra carved from a single block of dark, extraordinarily hard stone quarried in distant Nubia, showing the king seated on his throne with the falcon god Horus wrapped protectively around the back of his head, a masterpiece of Old Kingdom sculpture now housed in Cairo. It is also Khafra who is generally credited with commissioning the most unusual structure on the entire plateau, the Great Sphinx. Carved directly from the bedrock left over after quarrying stone for the surrounding pyramid complex, the Sphinx stretches about 73 meters long and stands over 20 meters high, giving it a human head on a lion's body, a combination that had no clear precedent in Egyptian art up to that point. Earlier, royal and divine imagery had paired animal heads, falcons, jackals, rams, with human or divine bodies. Placing a human face on a lion's body reversed that entire visual tradition, an artistic decision as bold in its own way as the engineering decisions being made a few hundred meters away. The Sphinx also appears to have been left unfinished in certain areas, and its precise original purpose and full symbolic meaning are still debated among Egyptologists, though its placement was almost certainly not accidental. Researchers have long D, that during the summer solstice, the setting sun appears to sink directly between Khufu's and Khafre's pyramids when viewed from near the Sphinx's position, a solar alignment that, if intentional, would tie the entire Giza layout, pyramids, temples, and Sphinx together into a single, coordinated religious and architectural plan, rather than three separate, unrelated monuments built by three separate kings. By the time Khafre's son, Menkaure, came to the throne, the plan for Giza faced a problem no amount of clever engineering could solve. There was simply no room left. Khufu and Khafre had already consumed most of the usable quarrying space on the plateau's high ground, right up to the edge where the Ahirso desert drops away into the surrounding wadis. Menkaure's pyramid, as a result, is drastically smaller than either of its predecessors, standing at around 65 meters tall with a base of roughly 105 meters, representing only a fraction of the stone volume used in his father's or grandfather's monument in Ts. Whether Menkaure intended this modest scale from the outset or was forced into it by circumstance remains a matter of debate, but the site's limitations were real. And excavators have even found evidence that workers had to lay down an artificial bedding of stone to level the ground where the Natu Ral bedrock ran out. In an unusual departure from standard practice, part of Menkaure's pyramid was cased not in fine white limestone, but in rough, extremely hard red granite, a material choice that may reflect either an unfinished building program, QT short by the king's death, or a deliberate stylistic statement, since granite was far more difficult and expensive to work than limestone. Even at reduced scale, Menkaure's complex shows the same attention to cosmic alignment seen in his predecessor's work. Later, Egyptian religious texts closely associate the three stars of Orion's belt with the god Osiris, ruler of the afterlife, and the layout of the three Giza pyramids on the ground has long been noted to Ichi. Oh, the layout of those three stars in the sky, with Menkaure's smaller pyramid corresponding to the star set slightly out of line with the other two, just as the smallest of the three pyramids sits slightly offset from a perfectly straight diagonal with Khufu's and Khafre's. Whether this was deliberate or coincidental continues to be debated by researchers, but the consistency of solar and stellar reference points across three separate reigns, the setting sun over Khufu's monument, the equinox alignment involving the Sphinx, and the stellar echo in Menkaure's arrangement, suggest that the Giza Plat on O as a whole was never planned pyramid by pyramid. It was planned as a single evolving religious landscape, one that three successive kings inherited, adjusted, and extended according to a shared cosmological vision, even as each of them left his own individual mark on it. What all of this adds up to is not a story of mystery or unexplainable achievement, but a story of methodical, generational engineering. Sneferu ran the experiments and paid for the failures. Khufu and Himyunu turned the accumulated knowledge into the most ambitious structure ever atum. Pted, supported by a logistics network precise enough that we can still read the actual daily schedule of the men who built it, written in their own hand, on papyrus that survived 4,500 years in a cave by the Red Sea. Djedefre shifted the religious framework that would define the rest of the Pyramid Age. Khafre used illusion, alignment, and one of the boldest sculptural inventions in ancient history to assert his place beside his father's monument. And Menkaure, working within the hard limits of geography and diminishing space, still found a way to tie his own smaller pyramid into the same cosmic plan. The Great Pyramid stood as the tallest structure on the planet for roughly 3,800 years, a record unbroken until the construction of Lincoln Cathedral in medieval England. That kind of endurance was never an accident. It was the product of careful planning, or trial and error, detailed logistics, mathematical precision, and religious ambition carried out by named, identifiable people: Sneferu, Hemiyunu, Khufu, Merer, Djedefre, Khafre, and Menkaure, whose decisions we can still trace today in the stones they left behind and, remarkably, in the words they left behind as well. If you found this breakdown of how the pyramids were actually planned and built interesting, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into ancient Egyptian history. And let me know in the comments which part of this engineering story surprised you the most. I read every comment, and I'll be back soon with the next chapter of this series.